The first thing I saw that morning was my fence coming down, not slowly, not by accident. A bulldozer was pushing straight through the fence line that had been there for years, throwing dirt across my yard like it was nothing. And behind the wheel was my neighbor. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. Then I saw the broken boards scattered across the dirt. That was my fence. I ran outside. "What the heck are you doing?" He stopped the bulldozer, climbed down, and looked at me like I was the one making a scene. "I'm fixing the property line," he said. I stared at him. "Your property line?" He pointed toward the ground. "That land is mine." He said it so confidently that, for one uncomfortable second, I actually questioned myself. Could I have remembered it wrong? Could that strip of land really belong to him? But then I looked at the fence. It had been there for years. I had maintained it, repaired it, and never once questioned where my property ended. And now my neighbor had driven a bulldozer straight through it. That was when I noticed. Something even worse. He hadn't stopped at the fence. The bulldozer had already pushed several feet into the yard I had always considered mine. He wasn't repairing a boundary. He was moving it. I asked him to stop. Instead, he told me I needed to move my things out of that section because it was his now. That word bothered me more than anything. Now, as if he could simply decide that part of. My yard belonged to him and make it true. I didn't want a neighborhood fight or people gossiping about us every time they checked their mail. I just wanted my home to feel like my home. But standing there beside that wrecked fence, I realized something. If I let him get away with this, the fence wouldn't be the only thing he'd take. So I went back inside and started digging through the old paperwork I'd kept over the years. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for proof, and buried among those papers was something I hadn't looked at in years, something that could prove exactly where that property line was supposed to be. I spread the paperwork across my kitchen table and started going through it one piece at a time. Some of it was old enough that the pages were yellow around the edges. Most of it was boring. Tax papers, receipts, old records from when I bought the house, nothing that immediately told me where the property line actually sat. Then I found the first document that mentioned the boundary. I read through it carefully, and my heart sank a little. It wasn't nearly as clear as I wanted it to be. There was an old description of the property, but nothing that simply said, "The fence goes here." For a moment, I wondered if my neighbor had checked something I hadn't. Maybe he'd found records showing that the fence had been in the wrong place for years. Maybe I had been living with that mistake without ever knowing it. But one thing still didn't make sense. If he really believed the land was his, why hadn't he shown me? Anything? Why bring a bulldozer first? Why tear down the fence before having an actual conversation? I looked back at the broken boards outside my window. That wasn't how you handled an honest mistake, so I kept searching. A few minutes later, I found an old photograph tucked inside one of the folders. It was a picture of the house from years ago. Nothing fancy, just the backyard, the house, and the fence running along the edge of the property. But there was something near the far end that caught my attention. A small marker. I hadn't thought about it in years. I pulled the photograph closer. Then I started looking through the older records again. This time, I wasn't just searching for a sentence that proved I was right. I was trying to understand the history of that boundary. Who had put the marker there? Why had the fence been built in that exact spot? And had anyone ever changed it before? That's when I found another folder. The papers inside were much older than the ones I'd been looking through. One document in particular caught my eye. It wasn't from when I bought the house. It wasn't even from the previous owner. It went back much further. I unfolded the faded page and read the description of the property. Then I looked toward the window. The section my neighbor had just bulldozed was sitting right there outside. I went back to the page, read the description again, and suddenly, that little marker in the old photograph didn't seem so unimportant anymore. It looked like a clue, because according to that old document, the boundary wasn't supposed to be where my neighbor had just put it. It was supposed to be somewhere else. And that meant the bulldozer hadn't just crossed a fence. It may have crossed a property line that had been documented long before either of us ever lived there. The next morning, I went back outside with the old document in my hand. The bulldozer was still sitting near the broken fence. So was my neighbor. He stood beside the machine, looking over the cleared section like he had already claimed it. I walked up to him. "I found something." He barely looked at the paper. "Good for you." I told him the old records showed the property line wasn't where he had moved it. He gave me a little laugh. "You really think some old piece of paper is going to change anything?" That answer told me a lot. He wasn't interested in figuring out who was right. He was counting on me getting tired. I asked him where his information came from. He shrugged. My records are clear. Then show them to me." His expression changed for just a second. Then he told me I was making this into a bigger deal than it needed to be. That old line, "You're making a big deal out of nothing." I think a lot of women know exactly how that feels. Someone crosses a boundary, then acts like you're difficult for noticing. Someone takes something, then tells you you're overreacting when you ask for it back. I wasn't going to argue with him anymore. I told him I wasn't moving anything until I knew exactly where the property line was. He shook his head. "Suit yourself." Then he climbed back into the bulldozer. I watched him drive away. That was when I made the call. A surveyor agreed to come out and check the boundary later that week. Finally, I would know exactly where that line was supposed to be. Until then, I kept the old document on my kitchen table. I looked at it more times than I want to admit, because now there was something at stake. If that old description matched the property, my neighbor had a serious problem. But if it didn't, I would have to face the possibility that the fence I'd trusted for years had never been in the right place. Then, the day before the survey, my neighbor came over again. This time, he wasn't laughing. He stood at the edge of the cleared land and said something that made me realize he knew exactly what was about to happen. "There's no need to bring anybody out here." I looked at him. "Why not?" He paused. Then he said, "Because I already know where that line is." And suddenly, I couldn't help wondering, how could he be so sure? The surveyor arrived just after 9 the next morning. My neighbor was already outside. Of course he was. He stood near the bulldozer with his arms crossed, watching as the surveyor walked around the property. I tried not to look nervous. After everything that had happened, I wanted one simple answer. Where did my property actually end? The surveyor checked the old records first, then he walked the property, stopping every so often to compare what he saw with the information on the papers. My neighbor followed him the whole time. Every few minutes, he'd make a comment, "That isn't where the line is," or "You're looking in the wrong spot." The surveyor didn't argue. He just kept working. Eventually, he stopped near the section where my fence had been. He looked at the old records again. Then he walked several feet farther into the yard. My neighbor's confidence seemed to disappear a little. The surveyor turned toward me. "This is the boundary." I looked down, then back at the broken fence. The fence wasn't the boundary. The old records had been pointing to something else, and the land my neighbor had cleared was on my side of that line. My stomach tightened. I had been right. But before I could even process that, the surveyor looked toward the far end of the property. "There's something else." He walked toward the area I'd seen in that old photograph, the little marker. I followed him. My neighbor followed too. The surveyor moved some dirt away with his boot. Then he stopped. "There it is." I looked down. A small, weathered marker was sitting in the ground, the same marker I'd seen in that old photograph. I could barely believe it had survived all these years. The surveyor compared its position with the old records. Then he looked at me. "This is important." My neighbor suddenly stepped closer. "What do you mean?" The surveyor didn't answer him right away. He pulled out the old paperwork again and checked the measurements. Then he looked back at the marker, and that's when his expression changed. He wasn't confused anymore. He was concerned. I asked him what he'd found. He pointed toward the marker. "This tells us something about where the original boundary was." I looked at my neighbor. He wasn't smiling anymore. But there was something else bothering me. If this marker had been here all these years, why had my neighbor been so certain the boundary was somewhere else? And before anyone could answer that question, the surveyor said something that made the entire situation feel much bigger than a broken fence. The surveyor looked at the old marker for a few more seconds. Then he checked the paperwork again. "This marker matches the older records." That was enough. I finally knew I hadn't imagined any of this. The fence had been where it was supposed to be. My neighbor had crossed the line, but before I could say anything, the surveyor turned toward him. "Had you seen this marker before?" My neighbor didn't answer right away. He looked at the ground, then at the bulldozer. Finally, he shrugged. "I don't remember." Something about the way he said it bothered me. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. But it wasn't the answer I expected from someone who had been so sure about that property line. The surveyor went back to checking the boundary. My neighbor stayed unusually quiet. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "How old is that marker?" The surveyor looked at the records. "It's been there a long time." My neighbor nodded. He didn't ask anything else. But I couldn't stop thinking about his question. Why that? Why not ask where the boundary was? Why not argue about the survey? Why was the age of the marker suddenly the thing he cared about? A few minutes later, the surveyor walked farther along the property. He stopped near the section the bulldozer had disturbed. Then he crouched down. I watched him brush some dirt away with his hand. He stood back up. There may be another marker here. I looked at him. Another one. He nodded. My neighbor finally looked over, and for the first time, I noticed something I'd missed before. His face had changed. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to worry. The surveyor pointed toward the disturbed ground. We should check before anything else gets moved. My neighbor stepped forward. I don't think that's necessary. The surveyor looked at him. Why not? My neighbor opened his mouth, then stopped. For a second, nobody said anything, and that silence told me more than his earlier arguments ever had, because suddenly I wasn't wondering whether the property line was mine anymore. I was wondering something much more uncomfortable. What did my neighbor know about that second marker? The surveyor carefully cleared the dirt around the second marker. It was smaller than the first one and almost completely hidden, but it was there. He compared it with the records, checked the distance between the two markers, and finally nodded. These two markers line up with the original boundary. I looked at my neighbor. He still wouldn't look at me. Then I noticed something strange. The dirt around the second marker had been disturbed recently. Fresh dirt, fresh tire tracks. The bulldozer had come very close to it. I asked the surveyor if the machine could have uncovered the marker. He nodded. It's possible. My neighbor suddenly spoke. I told you I was clearing the old boundary. I turned toward him. You knew where the old boundary was? He paused. I knew where the line was. That wasn't what he'd said before. The first time we'd spoken, he'd acted like the property line was obvious. Now he was admitting he'd known about an older boundary. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned the markers. He didn't answer. Instead, he said something else. The old fence wasn't exactly on the line. I looked at the surveyor. He nodded. That part is true. My heart sank for a second. Then he added, but the fence was still on your side of the boundary. My neighbor went quiet. I looked back at the torn-up yard, the broken fence, the tire tracks, the dirt covering the grass I'd spent years taking care of. Then I asked the question I'd been holding back. If you knew where the line was, why did you move the fence past it? He stared at me. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he finally said, I thought nobody would care about that little strip. I just stood there. That was the answer. Not confusion, not a misunderstanding. He had made a choice. He saw a piece of my property that he thought I wouldn't fight for, and he took it. The surveyor packed up his things and left. My neighbor stayed behind for another minute, staring at the ground. I didn't argue with him. I didn't threaten him. I simply went inside. For the first time since this started, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I picked up my phone and I called an attorney because getting my property back was one thing. Making my neighbor answer for what he'd already done was another. I thought the survey would finally make my neighbor back off. I was wrong. A few days later, he sent me a message. He said he was willing to resolve the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? After everything that had happened, that word almost made me laugh. He offered to rebuild the fence, but there was one catch. He wanted to rebuild it along the same line he'd claimed was his. He was still trying to keep that strip of my property. I didn't respond. Instead, I took the message, the survey, the old records, and the photographs of the damage to an attorney. He looked through everything. Then he said something that finally made the situation simple. The survey proves where the property line is, but we also need to establish what he knew before he crossed it. That made sense. The boundary was one issue. What he'd knowingly done was another. I showed him the message where my neighbor offered to rebuild the fence in the wrong place. My attorney read it twice. Then he asked me for every document I had. A few days later, my neighbor received a formal letter with the survey, the old records, and the photographs. It clearly explained where the property line was and what needed to be corrected. For the first time, I thought, this might actually be over. Then his response came back. He claimed the old fence had been in the wrong location for years. He said he believed he was correcting a mistake. And for a moment, that old feeling returned. What if he had some information I didn't know about? What if this became one person's word against another? I called my attorney. He didn't sound worried. Instead, he asked me one question. Do you still have the original property records from when you bought the house? I told him I did. Bring them in. That night, I pulled the old folder from the back of a closet. Most of the papers were things I'd seen before. Then I found one I barely remembered. It was an old transfer document from years before I ever owned the house. I unfolded it on the kitchen table. The boundary description was there. So were the same markers we just found. But there was something else. A handwritten note in the margin. I leaned closer. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to the previous owner of my neighbor's property. I read the note again. And suddenly I understood why my attorney had wanted to see this document, because it wasn't just describing the boundary, it suggested my neighbor may have known about it before he ever brought that bulldozer onto my land. I took the document back to my attorney the next morning. He read the handwritten note once. Then he read it again. Finally, he looked at me. "This changes things." The note was short, but it was specific. The previous owner of my neighbor's property had written that the boundary ran beyond the old fence and that the strip of land on my side belonged to my property. And there was one sentence that made my stomach drop. "Do not move the fence past the marked boundary." I read it again, then I looked at my attorney. "So they knew." He nodded. At least the previous owner knew. And suddenly my neighbor's strange behavior made a lot more sense. The old marker, his question about how old it was, the way he'd said, "I already know where that line is," and then the bulldozer. He hadn't simply stumbled across an unclear boundary. He had moved the fence into an area that the old records had specifically identified as mine, my attorney. Put the document beside the survey. The two matched. There was no longer much left to argue about. My neighbor had one final opportunity to make things right. He had to restore the fence to the actual boundary, repair the damage he'd caused, and cover the cost of fixing what his bulldozer had destroyed. This time, he didn't argue. A few days later, the crew arrived. I watched from my porch as they pulled out the posts he'd put in and rebuilt the fence where it had originally belonged. The dirt was repaired, the damaged section of my yard was cleaned up, and the little marker was left exactly where it had been. My neighbor stood nearby the entire time. He never apologized. He never admitted he had been wrong, but when the work was finished, he looked at the boundary marker for a long moment. Then he walked away. I stood there looking at the fence. It was strange. The fence itself wasn't worth nearly as much as all the stress that had come with it. What mattered was that I hadn't let someone else's confidence make me surrender something that was mine. He had counted on me thinking, maybe I'm wrong. He had counted on me deciding that a little piece of land wasn't worth fighting over. But I learned something that week. Sometimes a boundary isn't just a line in the dirt. Sometimes it's the moment you decide that someone else doesn't get to push you back simply because they're louder, richer, or more confident. My neighbor could move dirt. He could tear down a fence. He could act like the land belonged to him, but he couldn't change the records. He couldn't move the markers, and he couldn't move the truth. If someone had tried this on you, would you have fought for your property or walked away to keep the peace?